The LA Kings have a lot to deal with both on and off the ice. The Edmonton Oilers seem to be finding their game, and the New York Rangers may finally be turning a corner. We've got all of that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You could start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, win or lose on that first $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On LA Kings, Eddie Garcia. And Eddie, let's start with the big picture here. A lot of things going on in LA. I know the Kings are on the road right now. How big of a distraction have the Wildfires been? I know they had to cancel one game.
Yeah, it probably helps the team to be on the road, to be honest with you. But at the same time, they're also leaving behind family and friends that are in a situation that is uncertain. Things are looking better, but it's still, it's just been a horrific situation here. And for people who haven't been maybe glued to it the way we all are, we've had fires before. The thing that's really made this one different is the winds. We've had really strong winds, and it takes, a small fire, and those winds carry those embers all over the place, and it just spreads, and it's very difficult to get a handle on when it's so many places, all over spread out, so. And then the winds made it more difficult for the helicopters and the planes that drop the fire and the retardant and the water onto these things to do what they need to do. So that's what's made this one really different. And also, some of these fires in the past have been more in a foothill type area. Now these have hit pretty residential areas really hard. The Pacific Palisades, a lot of families live there. I mean, it's kind of an upper class neighborhood, but these are real neighborhoods, and it's been completely destroyed in other places as well. So it's been really hard. There's no way to kind of escape the reality of it, even if you're in a situation like me where I'm not really in an affected area and likely won't be. But you walk outside, you smell the smoke, the ashes on the car and the patio furniture, and it's on the news 24/7. And if you don't know people directly, you certainly know people of people, right, that have been affected by this. So as far as the team, though, again, maybe it's best that they're kind of away, but I'm sure their minds are also back home where, they at least know people who have been affected by this.
You've been watching the team over the whole season, many seasons. Do you think this has affected their play on the ice?
Well, they've only played 2 games, since. The first game was in Winnipeg, and I really think that they were inspired to kind of do their part to lift the spirits in their way of the city. And, they had a sticker on their helmet, they had a patch on their jersey, and they went out and played a very inspired game against a really good Winnipeg team and beat them on the road. And they said afterwards, hey, the city was in our hearts, and we wanted to play well for them. And so they did. The next game may be a letdown the very next night against not as good of a team, against the Calgary Flames, their game against was postponed. This was not the makeup game of the game postponed. And they didn't, they started well, but it kind of faded as it went along. And I don't know if it had an effect on them or not, but they've got Edmonton coming up on Monday. Huge game, obviously, against the team that has eliminated the Kings 3 straight years in the playoffs. And as it stands now, they probably will meet up for a 4th straight year in the postseason. The Kings beat the Oilers in LA recently, but that'll be a big game for the Kings. So we'll see how it affects them kind of going along.
Goaltending and defense have been strengths of this team. Right now, they are ranked first in the league, fewest goals allowed. Talk to me about the goaltending the Kings have been getting and why this team has been so successful defensively.
Well, I've always compared it, and I don't know if it's a good comparison or not, but the goaltending to me is like a quarterback with his offensive line. A quarterback can be very effective when he's got a great offensive line, when he's got all the time in the world to throw. And that's been the case for Kings goaltenders of late. Since Jonathan Quick has left, they've had some veteran fill-in goalies, Jonas Corposalo, Cam Talbot. Now it's Darcy Kemper. But even having said that, Kemper has been even better than I thought he would be. This is a guy that lost his starting job in Washington last year. He comes back to LA where he had spent a season before and was pretty good years ago before he went to Colorado and won a cup. And he seems to have been rejuvenated. I'm sure getting a chance to be a number one goalie again after what he went through in Washington was very motivational for him. And he's run with it. He's been better than expected. Top 10 in the NHL in goals against and save percentage. I think he might be even top 5. Maybe, if he can have a second half like his first half, maybe even a dark horse Vezina finalist. I think we all think Connor Hellebuck's going to win it, barring something crazy. But I think he has a shot at being a finalist, which would be huge. So he's played really well. But it is the defense. The team defense for the Kings is what their calling card is. It's what their identity is. And the defensive core has been really good without Drew Doughty all season, which has been surprising. Vladislav Gavrikov has moved from the second pairing on the left side to the top pairing on the right side, and he's been amazing. He's in a contract year, so this is going to turn into something really good for him in his career. He should get a big payday from either the Kings or someone else. So he's helped to really fill that void. Drew Doughty's coming back, hopefully in the next month. Maybe they're going to play, since they're playing so well, maybe they'll wait after the Four Nations tournament and give them some extra time because there's no rush. But again, the Kings calling card is their team defense, and their defensive core without Drew Doughty has been tremendous. And Jim Hiller, their head coach, has been running this 11-7 setup for most of the year with 7 defensemen. And it's worked out well, obviously, for the Kings. So the defense has been strong. They're in every game. They don't score a ton, but they usually score enough to win.
So you mentioned the Four Nations tournament. That is about a month away, give or take. And then you have a 10-day break and then maybe 3-4 weeks until the trade deadline. What do you see the Kings' biggest needs in the second half, and what do you see them doing to get ready for the playoff run?
Well, I think the good news is they don't need a lot. I think they feel really good about their top 3 lines. Pretty deep, pretty talented, all can, are effective. Again, there's no superstar, elite skilled guy on the team, but they have a lot of really good players. And I think right now the Kings are really, they're, greater than the parts, right? The what they make up as a team. They play great team hockey. It's not always as exciting as seeing somebody like Connor McDavid do the things that he does or whoever. But it's effective and they're winning and no one's going to complain. And but as far as what they need, their power play is atrocious. It really is. It's the one thing that you look at and say, that's bad. It's not below average. It's bad. And I don't know why. I really don't. I know they have a lot of left-handed shots. People have pointed to that, and maybe it kind of makes them just a team that's only dangerous on one side of the ice. But even then, it shouldn't be that bad. So if they can pick up a veteran right-handed shot who can be effective on the power play, I think that's what they would be looking at. I know there has been some talk about maybe Kyle Palmieri of the Islanders, who I know you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. So that's a name that has been mentioned. But again, if they're looking to add anything, and I don't think they're really looking to add much, I think that specific kind of player would be what they're looking for.
All right. Well, it's going to be a heck of a race. I know the standings are tight in the Pacific Division. Eddie, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can certainly just Google Locked On LA Kings. I always tell people make sure you include the LA, or you might get an NBA team from Northern California. Also, on social media at Locked On LA Kings. And if you want to hear more about the Kings, we'd love to have you join us.
All right, Eddie, thank you so much. Stay safe out there.
Thank you.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. From big upsets to game-winning drives, the NFL playoffs are just better with FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. The FanDuel app gives you everything you need for live bets, same-game parlays, and so much more. And it's not just the NFL playoffs. Hockey fans, use your knowledge of the game of hockey and your favorite team to get exciting opportunities on FanDuel. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com, FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the Monday show a familiar face for Locked On NHL viewers, Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers. And Nick, the Oilers have been playing some pretty good hockey over the last 15, 20 games. What's been the big difference for this team lately?
They finally got some bounces to go their way. The first month of the season, their penalty kill was the worst in the entire NHL. And if you'll recall, last year in the playoffs, it was perfect. They had one of the best penalty kills in the history of the modern NHL playoff format. So they started getting some bounces. And those stats, save percentage, shooting percentage, and the special teams, they started really poor on all three of those. Before Zach Hyman got hurt in mid-November, he had 3 goals through 20 games, and he's had triple that in the time since he came back to the lineup the first week of December. Nugent Hopkins, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, Hyman, who I had just mentioned, all 4 of those guys really weren't doing a whole lot, and it was really whether or not if they scored on the power play that given night was going to decide if they won the game or not, because they weren't generating enough 5-on-5. But since the middle of November, they've started to score a lot more, and that's taken a lot of heat off of their goaltending and their defense, because we can all be frank and objective here. We know the strength of this team is its forward group, and if they're not scoring enough, it's not really realistic to tell Stuart Skinner, Cal Pickard, and that defensive group, hey guys, less than 2 tonight or we're going to lose. It's not feasible in today's NHL.
Yeah, not going to happen all that often. Are they doing something differently besides getting healthy 5-on-5 that has contributed to the offensive improvement?
So first of all, they kind of lucked into Podkolzin really bringing something out of Draisaitl defensively that hasn't really been there at any point in Leon's career. I wouldn't say he was a liability defensively, but never really great in that end. And Podkolzin started the year on the 4th line, getting 11 minutes a night. He only played 40-something games for Vancouver last year, only had 12 points, something like that, the whole season, and he's well on his way to eclipsing all of those. That's number one. And then number two, they've really tinkered with the lineup a lot, even though they've been successful. They've been juggling guys all over the place, trying to find spots for them, for lack of a better expression. They haven't really found the ideal deployment for Jeff Skinner. I still think their best bet is hoping he can click with McDavid on his left and playing Nugent Hopkins with a combination of Adam Henrique, Connor Brown, or Janmark, whichever 2 of those 3 they'd like to play with Nugent Hopkins, because he hasn't been as defensively reliable or as offensively impactful as in years past. But the most straightforward is Podkolzin's worked really well with Draisaitl. Hyman has played with different places in the lineup. I mean, last week, Hyman was playing with Henrique and Connor Brown, and not Connor Brown. Connor Brown was playing up with McDavid, and Hyman was playing down on the 3rd line. And this is a guy who had 50 goals last year. So they're really trying to find ways to get that supporting cast going. Because if you go and look at the counting stats, once you get past McDavid, Draisaitl, Bouchard, there's a real drop off to that next tier of production. And that's kind of the key to this group is on most nights, Connor, Leon, and the special teams, that's enough. But when you get to later in the season and you get to these important games against good opponents, you need that secondary scoring, because I don't think it's realistic, as we said before, to bank on the defense. And the defense has been a lot better because they're not being asked to be the difference between winning and losing. Something I forgot to mention earlier when you had asked what changed, they're giving Brett Kulak the most minutes he's basically ever played in the NHL. He's gotten a lot of deployment with Darnell Nurse on the second pair. Troy Stetcher has kind of settled into a niche 13, 14 minutes a night type of role. Ty Emberson, they've brought along very slowly, but Brett Kulak's been really instrumental. And the first 15 games or so of the season, Darnell Nurse was on the ice for like half of the goals the Oilers had conceded through the first 15 games. And since then, the minutes have really kind of calmed down. And I think, to be fair to Nurse, injured most of the preseason, didn't play in a single preseason game, and needed that first month or so just to kind of get up to game speed. And through November, it was kind of hazy. But since November 23rd, they have like a 750 points percentage. So everything's kind of leveled out. I don't think they're as good as they've played over the last few weeks, because they're kind of just getting everything to go right in a lot of these games. And that doesn't feel like the best recipe. But when you look at the landscape of what's around them, other than really Vegas, the West is pretty wide open, and there's nobody else that's really in their tier, for lack of a better expression.
Talk to me a little bit about Evander Kane. When will we see him, and how should they handle his return?
That's a great question. I've done 3 separate episodes since the start of the regular season trying to guess that, because it's changed more than once. He came into training camp with the expectation of, I'm going to start the season on time. And then he did his preseason physical, and the lower body, that core injury that had pulled him out of the lineup in the playoffs, was ultimately said, we want to fix this. We'll clean this up. And they said 5 months, which would put him at about February. And he hadn't started doing on-ice stuff. He had just started doing physical therapy in the last few weeks. And then last week, the Oilers said, well, he's got his knee scoped. He had something that was not major, didn't need reconstruction, didn't need to be fixed, but they wanted to scope his knee, get some, I think they said there was something in his knee they wanted to get out of there. And that stops his rehab for the abdominal injury for 4 to 6 weeks, they said. So we're tentatively saying the first week of April if we're combining the 2 timelines, but not sure as far as how those 2 timelines interact with each other. As far as how they handle him, they already have too many forwards. Skinner has been healthy scratched more than once, and this is a guy you signed the first hour free agency opened, and you've yet to really find a spot for him. I don't really have a great answer for what they do with Evander Kane. He wants to play very clearly. I think if he can play, he's definitely one of their 12 best forwards, but they already kind of don't have enough spots in premium parts of the lineup. And you don't want to mess up things that are working. You don't want to take Podkolzin off of Draisaitl's line because that works. You don't want to take Hyman off of McDavid's line for too long. I think Evander Kane ends up getting onto the playoff roster, and they'll end up doing some cap shenanigans where he'll be healthy enough to start the playoffs, but won't have played at all in the regular season. And then I think he's almost certainly traded in the summer for cap reasons, because they can't afford to keep him with the decisions they need to make.
Obviously, we're starting the second half of the season right now. What do you think the Oilers need, and what do you think their goals are between now and the trade deadline?
So as far as their needs, coming into the season, the consensus was clearly another defenseman. I think if you can add a bona fide top 4 guy to play with Nurse, you can play Kulak on the third pair with Emberson. You entirely take Stetcher out of the lineup, and Stetcher's your first guy out of the press box if someone gets hurt. You've got a pretty deep group. You feel reasonably comfortable about that. We all know you probably need 7 or 8 defensemen to get to a cup final just based on the miles and how those games accumulate. They've been talking, Bob Stauffer had mentioned it on the Sportsnet broadcast last week, that they're looking at they want to add a righty, ideally to play with Nurse. They're looking at somebody who kills penalties. They're not particularly inclined for offensive production. Frank Saravelli had said David Savard of that ilk, somebody who's got playoff experience, but it's a little early. We don't know who's out of it yet, which kind of limits who we know is available, because with both conferences as wide open as they are right now, all it takes is a good week and you're right back in the mix, and you don't want to sell if you're right back in the mix.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see in what direction they go, but mostly D, you think, is where they're looking to
100%.
use this.
I think unless they were able to trade one of their extra forwards for another forward, if you were able to find a better fit than Jeff Skinner and you could do a player for a player thing, other than that, I think you're almost certainly adding a defenseman. I could understand an argument if you wanted to add a third goalie so you weren't going to Calvin Pickard in the playoffs should something happen, but I think that would be a luxury to have if you were able to add a third goalie. Defense is that's their biggest need. It was the biggest need opening night. It's their biggest need tonight.
All right, Nick, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
So you can find Locked On Oilers on all the major podcast platforms, on YouTube as well. You can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Nick Zararis, Nick Zararis, and I guess Instagram too. That is my Instagram handle as well. Thanks for having me, Gil.
Hey, thanks for coming by. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings together everything in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of my favorite features is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. It is great to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On New York Rangers, John Chick. And John, finally, a little winning streak here. 3 of the last 4 for the Rangers. What's been different?
Well, the short answer for that is literally everything. Just about every aspect of hockey that you can think of, the Rangers have improved upon it over the last 2 weeks. I think maybe that holiday break did them some good as well. Now, granted, they did lose their first 2 games coming out of said break, but they've overall been giving you a much more honest effort recently, and it just feels like they've kind of found themselves. The last handful of games in particular, they look a lot more like the team that we saw last season. But if I could point to one thing, I mean, we could literally talk about all day about all the things that they're doing better. But I think the biggest thing now is just better overall team defensive hockey. They came out of that break there, and they started scoring some goals. So they started to find themselves offensively a little bit, but the defense was still a little bit lacking. Now, when you're watching, this win against Vegas, this win against the Devils before that, even the Blackhawks game this past weekend, the theme is just better overall team defense. The Rangers early in the season were absolutely just bleeding odd man rushes against, and they're not good at defending them either. So that's obviously not a good combination. The amount of turnovers and just overall just bad play in the defensive zone was just frankly unacceptable, and just really surprising to see that come from a team that, last year had the best record in the NHL in the regular season. So they've really tightened that up. A lot of individual defensemen have stepped up recently. I think you look at a couple of the new D-men, Vakanainen and Borgen, the two of them seem like they're settling in a little bit, especially Borgen. He was awesome against Vegas. But yeah, man, it's really pretty much everything. But I think there's nothing more important than what I just said, the defensive aspect of the game being a lot better for the Rangers.
How did this team get off to such a bad start? How do you go from President's Trophy to last place in the Metropolitan Division with mostly the same roster?
Well, everything looked okay at first, the really early parts of the season. They came out and they were pretty good. I think they were 5-0-1, but then everything fell apart just as quickly, to your point, Gil. And, combination of things, it's strange. Like, there were just nights where it felt like there was just not really any sense of urgency. I can remember a 4-game road trip early in the season. They won the first 2. Then they lost to Calgary, didn't really play that well. And then against Edmonton, they come out, and I'm expecting them to bounce back and come out with their heads on fire and just a very lethargic performance. And that's when I started thinking, something's wrong around here. You look at, maybe the locker room was a little bit unstable because you had all the Jacob Trouba trade rumors in the offseason. Then he ultimately does get traded. I know some players weren't happy about the way that Barclay Goodrow was handled. He was, of course, placed on waivers, claimed by the Sharks. And then that memo that went out saying that the Rangers were open for business and we might trade Trouba, we might trade Kreider. So everything was kind of, I don't know what the word is, just kind of chaotic, I guess is the best thing you can say. And, in a way, a team is the sum of all of its parts. And when you look up and down the roster for, 2 months there, every single player had regressed from last season. Like every single player, other than Will Cooley, on this roster was better last season than they were this season. And in some cases, maybe that still is what's going on here, but things are starting to turn. A lot of individual guys are playing better. Lindgren's played a lot better recently. He was under fire from Ranger fans. Mika Zibanejad, nobody's caught more flack, and I include myself in this, from Ranger fans than he has. But he's been a lot better recently too, playing in all three zones like he's known to do, and has a nice little 6-game point streak going on as well. So team is the sum of all of its parts, and the parts weren't very good for that chunk that they were going through there. Everybody's struggling at the same time.
Who do you blame? Is this on the GM, the coach, the players? Obviously, there's a combination, but like, where do you primarily place the blame? It just seems like the ingredients were similar, but the soup didn't taste good.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good analogy, and I think that's pretty spot on. I think that works here. If I was going to rank those things, I would say it's on the players first, because at a certain point, Drury, I think sometimes does kind of lose track of the human aspect of this thing. And maybe the situation with Trouba in the offseason could have been held better. Maybe the same thing can be said for, Barclay Goodrow, essentially forcing him out of town. But at the same time, these guys are pro athletes, and players get traded, players get waived. I mean, this is not exclusive to the 2024-2025 Rangers. This has been happening for years and years, not just with the Rangers, but with every team and across all sports as well. So at a certain point, you could be mad about it for maybe a day or two, but man, eventually you got to suck it up and get back out there and do your job. And I think it's, for that reason, it's mostly on the players. After that, I would say maybe Drury is next most to blame. The last calendar year or so has not been great for Drury. I think he's had a good amount of really smart, really savvy moves that he's made as GM of the Rangers, but kind of a tepid trade deadline this past year when they're in position to maybe win it all. They didn't really do a whole lot there. And then all the aforementioned drama of this past offseason as well with Trouba and with Goodrow. So I think he would be second. And Laviolette, I mean, he's hanging in there, and it seems like he's finally got these guys, battling out of this. I wouldn't say he's blameless. No coach ever is when their team loses as much as the Rangers were, but I'd put him at the bottom of the list as far as most to blame. I think he's the least of all three of those parties.
So the Eastern Conference, the bottom half is wide open. The last two wild card spots, maybe even possibly third place in the Metro, kind of out there for the taking. Can the Rangers climb back into a playoff spot, and what do they need to do, let's say at the trade deadline, in order to get there?
Yeah, I think for sure. To your point, Gil, I mean, I know that, the kind of the middle portion of the Eastern Conference right now, it's really bunched up. There's just a boatload of teams within a couple of points of each other. But the Rangers are right there. And honestly, all it takes is one, solid stretch of winning hockey, and you'll kind of leapfrog some of these teams. It can look daunting with so many teams there, but you're one hot streak away from starting to climb right back up and maybe even get past a wild card spot, maybe even get back into the top three in the division. I think it's at least possible. As far as the trade deadline, I mean, the Rangers themselves are going to be the ones I think that do the most to determine what the approach is going to be there. Because if they can get themselves between now and then back into a playoff position, even if it is the second wild card spot, I think the Rangers will push forward. I think you will see them with some cap space now available to them. I think you'll see them add to the team at the trade deadline. But, if they falter again and if things start to go south, then the opposite could happen. You could see them sell off a Riley Smith or a Ryan Lindgren or, Will Borgen. I mean, I know he just got here, but he's a UFA at the end of the season too. And I think I'm getting to the point where I'd like to see Borgen extended. He's really done a nice job. But, yeah, man, it's all in the hands of the players. If they play well and they give this front office reason to believe, then I think they'll add. If not, though, if they're on the outside looking in, then I think you'll at least see them sell some of these guys that are UFAs at the end of the year and maybe open up some spots for some of the prospects that the Rangers have. Brett Berard could be back up. Brian Hoffman, I think we'll see him at some point this season too. So, yeah, man, it's all up to the players and how they perform between now and then.
So if they do add, what are they looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said if you talked to me as recently as a week and a half ago, I would have looked at defensemen for sure. But that group's kind of settling in pretty nicely right now. to the point where Zach Jones can't even get a game. I mean, he's been a healthy scratch for like at least 10 games in a row at this point, I think. And that's a whole nother story in and of itself. You'd like to see him crack the lineup every once in a while. But, you can always see somebody get added as far as like a forward is concerned, maybe like a top 9 kind of guy. They just claimed Arthur Kaliev off of waivers, but I don't think that's like the big move that they would do. I think a forward with, a certain amount of grit, good forechecking kind of forward would be nice. We'll see. It's a ways off, but I think you could see them adding, one defenseman and one forward if I had to take a guess at it, and if they are in position to buy, like we were talking about.
All right. Well, I know it'll be an interesting second half of the season. John, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, so YouTube, you can obviously watch the podcast there, or basically any audio streaming platform that you can possibly think of. The show will be available there as well. And you can find me on Twitter at jchick17, JCHIK17.
All right, John, thanks so much.
Thanks, Gil. Appreciate it.
Thanks for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. For your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Hockey. Become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from our hosts, Steele and Flip. Find Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank my guests. I want to thank Eddie Garcia of Locked On Kings, Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers, and John Chick of Locked On New York Rangers for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we are here every day, Monday through Friday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the league. And don't forget, Saturday, we now have our weekly women's hockey spotlight with Erica L. Ayala and Rachel Donner. So join us for that as well. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.